Hey guys. This is a Naruto and Percy Jackson crossover. What if Naruto was immortal and existed even before the gods themselves? Having a relaxing vacation? Avoiding trouble? Not when you're Naruto and Zetsu. Read on as an unlikely pair engages in shenanigans in a land they have no business being in. Hit like and subscribe if you like this one, and also please check the author in the description. Let's start. Chapter 1, Father and Son. I've never fully believed in his existence, for I thought it was nothing more than a myth. A man who walked the earth before the gods themselves? Surely it must be a jest, for that sounds the furthest away from a man. But alas, I was proven wrong, for we were one day visited by a man who resembled the one described in the ancient texts. Hair that looked to be woven from gold, eyes that resembled the sun itself, and a body that surpassed any warrior's. If that were not enough, the man had the audacity to empty our entire supply of flour. And for what else but his own personal meal? Preposterous. Inconceivable. And what even is this ramen he spoke so highly of? Testimony of a scribe of a rural Chinese village, 4900 BC. From Tales of the Great Sage by Professor Fujino Yasuhiro. There were virtually no creatures, apart from the oldest primordials, who could recall the age of shinobi, a period that preceded the golden age of humanity and succeeded the first age. The age of shinobi has long been considered the briefest era of world history, lasting only a few centuries as opposed to eons or millennia. It began with the sage of the sixth paths bestowing the gift of chakra onto humanity, and ended with a mass extinction event triggered by Gaia. None but a few beings out there could remember the exact sequence of events, but rumor has it started with a war that engulfed the world and shook the continents. It was a period that blurred the lines between godhood and mortality, where multiple men and women amassed so much power they would have been able to stand toe-to-toe with many modern pantheons. But among all these powerhouses, a lone being stood off from the rest of the earthly creatures. A figure known by many names, the most famous of which would be the gallant sage of the East. Despite the abundance of records detailing his sightings and interactions with men and women throughout human history, he was a cryptid even among the higher plane. None but the primordials and the elder deities of each pantheon could ascertain his existence nowadays. It does create a sense of paranoia among them. The thought of a being with so much power left unchecked was worrying. Who knows what such a creature could be planning? What sort of evil machinations could they be concocting? Chiba Prefecture, Japan, spring of 2000. Slurp. Crunch crunch. Hey Pops? Yes, son? I'm bored. Wait. Don't you dare. Hi, bored. I'm Dad. UGGHHHHHH. Sli Europe. A couple sat in a seiza position on top of a cliff overlooking the sea. Well, one was sitting, the other was writhing in what appeared to be physical pain on the ground. The tallest was a blond man, holding a hot ceramic bowl of ramen in his calloused hands and using chopsticks to inhale the noodles at an almost inhuman pace. His whiskered cheeks were puffed out while his eyes were closed in bliss, making the man resemble a fox. Despite his seemingly non-threatening appearance, his body spoke of a different matter entirely. As he knocked the bowl back to drink the still steaming broth, the shirt he was wearing hiked up, showing his toned abs decorated by red flame-like orange markings. The same markings went over his arms in a manner resembling a tattoo. As he was done with his meal, the bowl disappeared in his left hand in a puff of smoke, while a similar bowl appeared in his right hand, which the man proceeded to attack with the same vigor. He did not seem the least bit disturbed with how his lunchmate was acting and continued to consume the noodly goodness with the enthusiasm. Sli Europe. His companion, however, looked less human. The average person would probably mistake them for an imp because of their small stature, a little under 3 feet, and their midnight black complexion, partially covered by a child-sized green yukata. The little creature was barely getting back together from the reflexive disgust it felt towards the terrible attempt at humor, and looked back for the whole fried chicken it had been munching on. Shrugging, it took a bite out of it, consuming both meat and bones in one go. It then looked up at the one they called Pops, the large yellow dots that served as its eyes being filled with curiosity. It finished swallowing the food before opening its Glasgow-like mouth to speak. So, what should we do today? Gulp. The blonde swallowed the handful of noodles he had shoved in his mouth before shifting his own strange set of eyes onto the creature. A pair of blue eyes with a central golden ring gazed upon the one the man considered his son. Meh. I'm up for anything you want, he replied nonchalantly, shrugging his shoulders before continuing his meal. His son scratched his horned head in thought, removing the large cone hat he wore in the process, and revealing his moss-colored hair. The smaller male contemplated their next course of action. It has been a few decades since anything exciting happened in the world. Ever since the end of World War II, Asia did have a few skirmishes here and there that occupied the duo, but nothing as major as the Great War. He wouldn't complain about peace, as moderate as it was, because that seemed like something his own father yearned for. But he still wished for something to do. They had already been all over the world, traveling the 5 continents for millennia in search of adventure and great foodstuffs. However, the blonde had insisted on staying in the Far East for the last few centuries. Naruto and Uzumaki was strong, perhaps one of the strongest beings on the planet. There was little in the world that he felt apprehension towards. Well, anything not omnipotent, that is. I'm strong too, not as much as Pops obviously, but I can hold my own, and if push comes to shove, I'll just call for help, the shorter of the duo thought. There had to be a sensible reason for his father's decision, but for the life of him, he couldn't think about anything. Maybe it was his own apathy towards most living creatures that weren't his family or those he considered precious, but there was simply no valid excuse for them not to do whatever they wanted. After all, who's gonna stop us? You know, I've been getting sick of Japan and Asia in general. We traveled everywhere here. And yeah, the dishes are great and all, the people too, sometimes, but I just wanted some more variety. Why can't we visit Europe again? Or the Americas? Asked the little guy. Naruto sighed, putting his empty bowl down and gazing upon the sea in thought. It's complicated. Well, make it not complicated. The son crossed his arms and rumbled, to which the blonde raised an eyebrow at the unexpected lip. Little sassy guy, aren't you? Naruto asked, making Zetsu wince and grumble under his breath. A good way to put it is, I can't afford to go there anymore. How? You're stronger than ever, Pops. The green-haired young man almost screamed in exasperation. That's just it, Zetsu. I'm too strong. Do you realize how threatened my very presence makes people feel? Let alone beings who can actually sense my power? The blonde explained and gestured widely. At Zetsu's incredulous gaze, he decided to elaborate. What do you think happens when someone unfamiliar with us meets either of us? The short man scratched his head. They'd flee? Naruto shook his head. While that may be true for weak creatures like most humans and monsters, it's another story when it comes to deities or beings of a higher power, especially those with too much pride for their own good. Zetsu tilted his head as he listened to his father. Most of those beings would see me as a threat, regardless of my intentions. And what do you think they'd do if I enter their zones of influence? Let me prance around? He questioned his son, who nodded his head in understanding. No, they wouldn't. Many of them would start blasting before asking questions, regardless of where I was, Naruto continued. You've never truly experienced it because of your own ability to suppress yourself, but me? This is all I had to deal with for the first few thousand years of my life. If it wasn't that stupid Jade Emperor throwing his army at people like me or my siblings, I wouldn't have garnered any reputation here. The man yelled in irritation. But why stay here then? Why stay anywhere? Asked Zetsu. Because now, people know I'm not someone to mess around with. The Taoists and Hindus know to keep their distance, and the Shinto are alright with me. Amaterasu-chan made sure of that. Not to mention I have allies here. Don't forget your uncles in the sage realm. Zetsu nodded at the explanation, thinking deeply. It really makes sense when I think about it. Pops and Uncle Kurama alone are some of the top dogs out there, so there's really nothing to fear. Plus, everyone in Asia sort of keeps their distance from us. Naruto had forged many friendships among the supernatural in the Asian continent, many of them strong enough to be considered a pantheonic threat like he himself was. He had a pull here that he lacked in the other parts of the globe, especially in the West. Zetsu heard and read a lot of bad things about the so-called gods dominating the Western Hemisphere. Be it Zeus' vindictiveness and paranoia, Odin's similar but more calculative personality, or even Ra's sheer sadism. But compared to their power base, there really wasn't anything the Western pantheons could pull that would catch them flat-footed. They simply had too much raw power to be challenged. But that doesn't mean either of the pantheons would be cowed into nonviolence. They had too much pride and too little care for anything they considered below them. Naruto wasn't afraid to fight them, but any fight he might get into could become very destructive, damaging both the environment and the populations living in the region. Something that he, as a sage, cannot allow himself to do. But Zetsu found himself racking his brain for another argument. He didn't personally care as much as his father for any potential consequences their presence could cause, but he had thought up a way to prevent those scenarios and he hoped Naruto would agree. I mean, we don't have to announce ourselves, you know? I could use air, you know, that the little guy tried to convince his father. You mean that technique you've been working on? What did you call it? The man scratched his whiskered cheek in thought. Mole in plain sight, Zetsu spoke with a level of pride. The technique had been his pet project for quite a while, and one that could offer up a solution for their dilemma. It was a similar skill to the second Setsukige's dustless bewildering cover, which hid the user's presence and chakra completely from other shinobi. Zetsu initially wanted to take it a step further, and completely erase the user from everyone's radar, including all-seeing beings like the astral or sky deities of multiple pantheons. Failing to accomplish that goal, Zetsu opted to shift his objective from erasing one's presence to blending it with the surroundings. The technique was powered purely by senjutsu, which he and his father were both masters of. Nature chakra would constantly coat the body in a thin opaque layer while sending a mist of diluted chakra in the area surrounding the user. Nature chakra would act as a masking agent for the other kinds of chakra within the body, thus making it seem as if the user was made of pure senjutsu, or pass him off as a nature spirit. Since he and his father both had a great grasp on senjutsu, that was an easy task. The problem, however, I got it down, but I still have an issue. The jutsu depends on the user's concentration. You have to be constantly focusing on it to maintain it. This means that any lapse of focus could land us in the crosshairs of any supernatural being with a sensing capability, explained Zetsu, while Naruto gained a surprised look followed by a proud one. You did? That's my boy. Bahahaha. The blonde father laughed joyously as he scooped up his child and held him up, much to the son's annoyance. After all, that was an achievement of the highest order. Hiding their power from other deities was near impossible. If they made themselves invisible to the eye with a jutsu, they could still be detected by powerful sensors. Simply walking into a pantheon whose authority they had no positive relations with was out of the question, especially if what he heard about that Zeus brat was true. His son, however, was ironically like a sponge. Hey, get it? Because he was half-plant, he simply absorbed information and thought up unpredictable ways to use it. Quite the outside-the-box like himself at his age, but his boy was also a born genius. That was far from the first jutsu he invented, but Naruto still felt a swell of fatherly pride every time his boy made such discoveries. But Zetsu's problem was a pretty big one. Old as he was, Naruto was still Naruto, meaning he could never give all his focus to a single task for too long a period. Especially considering the technique will need to stay active when they inevitably go to sleep for the night. It simply wasn't possible for them to remain completely hidden for such a long time within the other party's radar. Then again, did they really have to? Naruto has been alive for eons. He had more than enough time to become the master of masters of the shinobi arts, especially the art of Fuinjutsu, and the knowledge behind jutsu shikis and even some of the Western runes. The idea came to him almost instantly, a seal to act as a nature chakra battery with a multi-layered jutsu shiki to act as both a chakra filter and a circuit around the body. The proud father narrowed his eyes, ignoring his son's trashing as the boy attempted to escape the hold of his captor's fatherly pride. Now all I need to do is put the idea into practice. Moyuch, Naruto yelped as Zetsu finally had enough and opted to use his powerful teeth to bite at his father's arms. Let me down, Pops. Not until you learn to accept my fatherly affection. Are you seriously trademarking this? Screw you, I'm the best dad in the world, I can trademark fatherhood itself. Besides. Oh no. I wouldn't be much of a patent if I wasn't the best I could be, eh? Get it? UGHHHHHHHHHHH. Chapter 2, Children's Day. The fool stood defiant. The king brought down his judgment. The fool laughed in mirth. And chaos enveloped the earth. Excerpt from apocryphal Taoist text found in the Huanghe Valley, 390 BC. Alluded to refer to the mythological heavenly war between the Jade Emperor and the Great Sage. East Highland Park in Richmond, Virginia, 1st of June 2000. In one of the park's clearings, Naruto woke up to the first rays of dawn. It's been a few months since his son had announced his great accomplishment, and Naruto had stayed awake for the next few weeks working on the seal and shiki formulas. Making the individual seals had always been easy. It was the inevitable trial and error of constructing a new jutsu shiki circuit to complement the seals that always took time. But then, the end result spoke for itself, as it always did nowadays. Both Naruto and Zetsu could now walk into the heart of a pantheon and be mistaken for nature spirits, if a little stronger than the average one, but nothing to raise an alarm about. As long as either used any of their bigger techniques and stuck to the more basic ninjutsu, there would be nothing to worry about. Yawning deeply and stretching his back to like one might compare to a cat, he inadvertently woke the small group of animals that had taken to spend the night on various parts of his body. A sparrow that had nested in his hair chirped angrily at the rude awakening and flew off to a nearby branch. A litter of fox cubs that had curled up on his stomach yipped at the sudden movement, and scrambled off to run into the bushes. A few other rodents that had leaned into him reacted similarly, albeit more out of surprise than fear or panic. Naruto laughed. Hee, sorry guys, a man shouldn't stay in bed earlier than the sunrise, you know. Pops? A voice called out from a nearby tree. The blonde turned from his position on the grass to see his son had woke up as well and was gripping one of the lower branches lazily, reminding him idly of a small chimp. Well, good morning, my dear boy. How's it hanging? Naruto exclaimed jovially. Oh God, please don't start. It's too early for this. Zetsu felt himself go slack as his father waved him off. Nah, never too early for quality comedy. Ugh, the little man groaned and let himself fall before ambling over to his father. Both of them had chosen to spend the night in the park, instead of a hotel like any sane person would. Both of them being sages made them feel more at home in a grassy field or a thick forest than in any five-star hotel. It had been something of a habit for both father and son to simply sleep where they found themselves at night, never worrying about shelter. So what's for today? I was thinking we could try the Chinese food here. It's different from the authentic stuff, Zetsu asked, looking up at his father. Ha! Didn't you say you were getting sick of it? I got bored of the same flavors they used in China. Apparently the selection here uses a lot of local ingredients, and even changes up the cooking recipes so the result is pretty different, the little man said. That's so? The blonde looked pensive before nodding to himself. Yup, Chinese breakfast food sounded good. They could always get ramen for lunch or just do some meat shopping since Zetsu was such a connoisseur. Yosh! Let's go! Naruto crowed excitedly and started speed walking to the entrance of the park, all the while ignoring the looks he was getting from early joggers. Zetsu shook his little head. Even though his father was older than most things on the planet, he still acted the same hyperactive way even after the millennia they spent together. Later on, they happened upon one of the more popular food chain restaurants, and much to the bafflement of the waiting staff proceeded to order 2 of everything on the menu. When their orders arrived, both analyzed the platters with a critical eye, unwittingly making their waitress sweat, before each picked up a fried wonton and threw it in their mouths. Munch munch. On that day, Naruto and Zetsu and Uzumaki solemnly swore never to touch Chinese-American cuisine again. The day passed pretty quickly for the duo of tourists. There wasn't much to do in Richmond that would interest them. That, and both were still pretty upset about their breakfast. While the food had tasted good enough, the problem lay in the label. You cannot simply fry half the ingredients then call it Chinese. Since when do Chinese recipes include so much oil? And don't even get me started on the flavor. Sugar and salt are not fucking seasonings. You don't just drown your chicken in it. Naruto ranted bitterly. So he had a refined palate. Sue him. He's been alive for longer than these recipes have existed. He practically invented some of these. He had half a mind to barge into the kitchen and give the cooks a piece of his mind, but Zetsu, bless his soul, seemed to know his father's train of thought and convinced him against it. The cooks weren't at fault. It was whoever's sorry excuse for an entrepreneur who thought that making a quick buck was worth practically scamming people out. Nevertheless, the blonde calmed himself and put the entire thing behind him. He needed to focus on the future. There were so many more towns to visit, so much food to eat, and so much fun to be had. He and his boy were going to bond. The son in question had shifted his appearance into that of a small blonde and blue-eyed child. He tried going for the most inconspicuous look he could get, which would logically be one that resembled his dad. It made Naruto blush at the wholesome sight. He needed to immortalize this image. The father hurriedly took his camera and hollered at his son to stand in front of a random landmark they passed by. He wanted to take pictures of his adorable son. As Naruto proceeded to barrage a reluctant Zetsu with pictures taken at different angles, he was unaware of the wary looks he was receiving from the onlookers. The man was decked out in dark green cargo shorts and an open kimono shirt with a swirl design, over a white t-shirt with the words "No Ramen and No Life" written in bold orange text. He looked like what one might expect the stereotypical tourist to dress like, and that image was further amplified by the straw hat and blue-tinted round sunglasses he favored. But what seemed like the cherry on top of the entire, frankly embarrassing, ensemble was the footwear. Naruto was wearing Crocs and felt absolutely no shame for it. Zetsu insisted on keeping his head down in shame at his father's horrifying fashion sense, despite the latter's incessant demands to give him a winning smile. The photo session finished as quickly as it started, and the dad continued dragging his son through the city, even opting to carry him on his shoulders as one would do to a toddler. Zetsu hated that he kind of liked being babied and doted on by Naruto. As annoying as the man was sometimes, with his antics and god-awful dad jokes, Zetsu still very much loved his father and the attention he received from him. He could understand slightly where his dad was coming from, having been told bits and pieces of the blonde's past through some of his more loose-lipped uncles. Naruto never liked talking about his past, but the way he handled all the tragedies he suffered as a mortal and translated them to a titanic amount of love for his precious people spoke well of his character. The blonde created him thousands of years ago. The green-haired youth was born from Naruto's will and would have happily served his creator as a tool to be used and discarded. That was how much loyalty Zetsu had in him since he came into the world. It was an instinct that he later learned was also present in his predecessor, the first Zetsu created from Otsutsuki Kagaya's own will. However, unlike that wretched woman, his father had gone through the length of not only seeing him as his progeny but also giving him the childhood that the elder Uzumaki never got. Be it carrying him like a toddler everywhere in his first few years, or celebrating every birthday as a family, Naruto never hesitated to shower his son with love and care. He satisfied his childish curiosity and did everything in his power to support the younger male's dreams and desires. That was one of the many reasons the blonde would always be the most respected figure in Zetsu's heart. It was also the reason he took upon himself an oath to never end up like the first Zetsu. He never wanted to cause his family pain or stray from the moral path laid down by his father. Zetsu would always be by his father's side, even with the latter's embarrassing antics. As night fell, the pair found themselves having a walk along with one of the quieter neighborhoods in the city. It had barely been a few days since they'd arrived in the city, and Naruto was ready to hop to another state. Zetsu was of a similar opinion. He'd already gotten his fill from visiting the local parks and butcher shops, and subsequently getting dragged out of them by Naruto after verbally assaulting some of the vendors. The shorter male was as obsessed with meat of all kinds as Naruto was with noodles. While his father had explicitly forbidden him from eating human flesh, or the flesh of innocent humanoid creatures, everything else was fair game. Zetsu made sure to use that freedom to its fullest, experimenting and enjoying the flesh of nearly every creature he could sink his teeth into, and that his dad did not blacklist. He has come to consider himself as very knowledgeable in his hobby, and would not tolerate people giving less than their best when serving him. Which was demonstrated through the metaphorical roast he delivered upon some of the vendors that did not give him a satisfying deal. The other customers had edged away from the tiny child who brought grown men to tears with his words, which had caused Naruto to make a tactical exit every time. While Zetsu was silently contemplating on the day he spent, Naruto simply closed his eyes and let his senses sweep over the entire district. He did not even need to use Sage Mode. His senses had become very sharp over time, to the degree where he could map out his surroundings in his mind. It was always an interesting experience for him to simply let his spirit wander over the area around him. It served both as a means of staying alert and stress-relieving practice. The distinct sounds of bestial growling and startling human shouts suddenly assaulted his ears. His eyes snapped open as his body tensed in response, something that did not go unnoticed by Zetsu. Before the younger Uzumaki could ask, the blonde blurred out from sight in a burst of speed. An image of the scene had already formed within his mind's eye, and he had to react accordingly. While a body flicker would have been faster, the sage still had to maintain his cover. Naruto ran at subsonic speeds before jumping and bouncing off the walls of nearby buildings. He ran the entire distance in less than a few seconds before he found himself soaring over the scene of trouble. Two abnormally big black wolves, each about the size of a sedan, had cornered what looked like two young teenagers and a child to the back wall of the alley. The blonde did not bother observing the obvious victims. He landed on the wall above the three in a crouch, before rocketing at tremendous speeds towards the two large canines. To any onlookers, the movement would have been nigh instantaneous. A yellow blur suddenly passed by the animals before the two exploded into golden dust. The man landed in a crouch, arms crossed over his chest and hands drawn out in a chopping motion. He stood up, put his hands on his hips, and cracked his neck to the side before turning towards the three kids. The oldest teenager, a lanky blonde-haired youth dressed in a t-shirt and a pair of torn jeans, held what looked like a bronze golf club in front of him in a threatening manner. Although from the expression on his face, he was still recovering from the shock of the sudden rescue. The same could be said for his older female companion, a young black-haired lass in a punk ensemble who held a bronze spear up in front of her. One of her hands held the shoulder of the last of the trio, a little blonde girl of about 7 years who, while hiding behind the leg of the black-haired teenager, still grasped a small hammer tightly in her hand. Naruto's fatherly instincts flared up immediately at the scene. The three didn't look injured, a little roughed up from running probably, but nothing to be alarmed about. However, being the caring person that he was, the sage had to make sure the three were doing well. So, putting on his best foxy grin and raising a hand in greeting, he tried to disarm the situation and calm them down the best way he knew how to. "Hey kids, a bit of a rough night we have, ain't it?" he asked, and could almost hear the groan of disappointment from an approaching Zetsu. The two teens still looked wary, even if the ravenet cringed in response before a tiny giggle erupted from the little girl. Naruto's grin only widened. "Oh? Is that some appreciative laughter I hear? Ha! Finally, someone who appreciates my perfect talent." The little blonde only giggled harder, eventually infecting both teenagers with her childlike mirth and letting their guard drop a little. "Who are you?" asked the lanky blonde, still holding up the golf club, but in a more relaxed manner. "Era?" Naruto closed his eyes and tilted his head. "Isn't it more polite to introduce yourself before asking others?" The boy narrowed his eyes in suspicion. "Humph, fine, I'm Luke," the boy huffed before gesturing to his two companions. "This is Talia and the kid is Annabeth." He was swiftly elbowed by Talia, who proceeded to admonish him. "Luke, don't just give our names to a stranger. You saw what he did. He could be a monster." Her shout prompted an offended look to appear on Naruto's face. "Oh, aye. Monster? I ain't no monster, girly. Do I look like a monster? Name's Naruto. I'm just a guy who can punch stuff real good," he exclaimed while waving his hands in protest. "Don't screw with me. No mortal could do what you did." Talia refused to back down and held up her spear threateningly. "Mortal? Monster?" thought Naruto, registering her accusation before realizing, "Oh, if I focus a little I can faintly see these kids' connections, they're probably demigods." The connections he was talking about were the faint bridges of energy that linked the trio to separate domains. Those connections would usually be barely visible for demigods, as they did not have the same amount of control over the domains that their godly parents had. He thought over his next course of actions. He couldn't very well come out and admit his real identity, so he settled on what he and Zetsu discussed. Ha! Well, you got me. I'm not normal. I'm what you would call a clear-sighted mortal. I trained very hard to become strong. So I couldn't let these bad dogs hurt you, kids. If I was a monster, we wouldn't be having this discussion right now. Talia frowned before huddling with Luke to discuss Naruto's words quietly. While that was happening, Zetsu finally made his appearance, having shifted his body to look like a teenage version of Naruto, albeit leaner and dressed in a less ridiculous manner. Pops? Who are these kids? The younger Uzumaki asked, snapping the two demigods from their discussion. The youngest blonde had taken to hiding behind them and poked her head out to look at the newcomer. Ha! We're the same age. And who are you? The Ravenet questioned. Oh. Naruto grabbed his son by the shoulder and gestured toward him proudly, uncaring of the younger Uzumaki's annoyance at the action. This is Zetsu. My son. He likes grilled meat and gardening. Ain't he a handsome fella? He almost shouted in glee, as he did every time he introduced his little boy. Zetsu grumbled under his breath, saying something along the lines of I could have just introduced myself before looking at the three kids in front of him. Looking at the scene and the pure expression of happiness on the older blonde's face, the older demigods felt their worries ebb away. For some reason, they could not help but trust the elder blonde. He simply had an air of warmth around him that compelled them to let their guard down. The youngest girl strode forward, while Talia led her, not bothering to call her back but still watching the man with a wary eye. The child stood in front of Zetsu and gave him a toothy smile in greeting. I'm Annabeth. I like books and architecture. Nice to meet you, Zetsu and Mr. Naruto. Her gray eyes looked up at the man. Naruto grinned and Zetsu tensed in dread. You are getting adopted, the sage thought in glee. Chapter 3: A Strange Family. The Jade Emperor kneeled from exhaustion, his features marred with sweat, grime, and ichor. His once pristine robes were barely held up at the seams and his red hair, once expertly coiffed, was singed and messy. But the most problematic injury seemed to be on his forehead, which was grasped tightly by his left hand as ichor escaped through his fingers. His opponent walked towards him with a steady gait, hefting an obsidian-colored bowstaff on his shoulder. The large man stopped before the kneeling redhead, and the latter needn't look up to see the man's cold expression. It is saddening that it had to come to this. The man spoke, looking down at the kneeling deity, who only chuckled mirthlessly. Saddening? Please, spare me those false platitudes. It would have always come to this. The Jade Emperor snarled. Would it? I have offered you my hand in friendship many a time. If you had tried letting go of your useless pride, then we could have lived side by side as allies. The man's tone was a contrasting calm to the Emperor's rising ire. Side by side? With humanity? With demons? You dare imply our kind would ever stoop so low as to consider you lot our equals? The deity's face had started to purple in rage. The sage simply smiled pityingly at the fuming man, inadvertently causing his anger to boil even more. Immortality is a privilege. The power you hold is a privilege. Only our kind should have access to it. How dare you besmirch our land with your very existence? The red-haired emperor finally lost it, and removed the hand he held to his face, showing a healed third eye. The organ that allowed him almost complete control over the natural forces of the universe. In response, the sage shifted the staff into a mala bead bracelet, and clasped his hands in prayer in front of him, eyes closed. Jade Emperor. No, Okwang, there is one thing you and these other gods never seem to understand. The sage opened his eyes, as a grim smile slowly bloomed on his face, and his power spiked in response to the deity's own. And that is a creature's infinite potential for evolution. Thus, their battle resumed once more. A battle forgotten by time. Many millennia ago. What is this? Zetsu knew who he was from the second his eyes first opened. The first thing he ever saw was the giant face of a whiskered blonde man giving him a large toothy grin. He knew who he was. "This is my lord." The man's grin did not waver, even as he opened his mouth to speak. "Hey there, little fella," he cooed softly, "what should I name you?" Assuming the question was directed to him, Zetsu automatically gave his response. "I am Zetsu," he said emotionlessly, before continuing, "What is my purpose?" The man lost his smile as his face morphed into an unrecognizable emotion. "Eh?" the man uttered, which Zetsu assumed as a request for clarification. "My lord, what is my life's purpose?" the newborn intoned. The man staggered, still holding the little boy. What? Purpose? What do you mean, boyo? Why are you asking me? Shouldn't you know? Should I? You are my creator, I shall thus serve you to the best of my ability, Zetsu answered simply as if speaking about the weather. Ha! Why you? Zetsu-chan. No! That's not I. The man seemed confused. He wasn't making an entire and concise sentence. Did I do something wrong? The boy asked innocently, and the man finally snapped out of his stupor. He looked at him and muttered something inaudible under his breath. The silence between them stretched for a long time as the man gazed at him, although his eyes were distant as if he was lost in thought. Finally coming out of his stupor, the man frowned before his expression shifted into a gentle one. His voice was but a whisper, yet his words were heavy. Zetsu-chan, you are my son. The blond man then held Zetsu above and turned him around. Zetsu finally saw where they were. His vision was filled with pink as he saw the forest of cherry blossoms they stood in the middle of. The newborn was momentarily taken aback by the beauty of it all, so much so that his eyes involuntarily watered. I am your father, the man said kindly yet firmly. If there was any way to describe it, Zetsu would say his soul suddenly felt lighter, although he had no idea why. This beautiful world is yours to explore and to frolic in. Grow up to be healthy, strong, and happy, but most importantly, Zetsu-chan. The young Uzumaki was hooked on his father's every word. Your purpose is whatever you decide it to be. These words would remain etched into the newborn's soul for the rest of eternity. Bull Run Regional Park in Manassas, Virginia, 7th of June 2000. Zetsu. Zetsu. The annoying voice of his father brought him out of the memory. What, Pops? What is it? He snapped at the man. The sage pouted like a child before looking at the blonde girl he was carrying on his shoulders. See, Annie? See how my son is so mean to me? He dramatically wept, making the little girl giggle at his antics. Ugh, his Pops was so immature sometimes. Annabeth patted his father on the head like one would a horse before turning to him. Zetsu. Don't be a jerk to Mr. Naruto. His father mouthed the same words to him, furthering the boy's annoyance. His father was a child. An immature little child. Ugh. Whatever. What do you want, Pops? The man frowned. We'll have to discuss that lip of yours later. Before the son could retort, the man continued, but little Annie here asked you a question. You gotta stop daydreaming like that, my boy. Zetsu huffed in annoyance before turning to the girl. He waited expectantly. Well? He finally asked her, and she blushed in embarrassment. Yeah. Oh yeah. I wanted to ask what you wanted to be. You know, like when you graduate school and stuff. Wait. Why aren't you in school? Are you skipping? Zetsu held his head at the barrage of questions. God damn it, this was supposed to be a relaxing vacation. Hell. Why did his Pops insist on taking these kids with them? They were demigods? As in related to the very beings Naruto claimed he wanted to avoid. Zetsu internally screamed in frustration. This was why he sometimes hated his father's good nature. Ahead of the trio, the two elder demigods were having their own hushed discussion. Are you sure you can trust them with Annie? Talia asked her companion with a frown. She didn't like the thought of leaving her surrogate little sister in the stranger's hands. Even if it had been a full week since they all met. I don't, but we have to play it cool, Luke answered before adding, and while I think it's still too early to trust them, they haven't shown themselves to have any ill intentions or monsters in disguise. You mean besides the ridiculous strength they seem to have? The raven-haired girl responded sarcastically. She didn't buy that bullshit about Mr. Whiskers being a black belt in multiple martial arts or his son being a prodigy. Black belts don't just punch through cyclopes. Do they? The group had come across several monsters in their journey, all of which were very easily dispatched. If not by the Uzumakis, then by the elder demigods. But that wasn't the problem, however. The issue came with how both father and son were obviously hiding something. She couldn't help being suspicious. From pretending to be awed by how tough punching a hellhound's head clean off was, to how coincidental their first meeting had been. It all pointed to interference from their godly family, and neither Talia nor Luke liked it. Both had suffered enough at the hand of the so-called benevolent Olympians. Luke lost his only family to a curse-induced madness, and Talia lost her younger brother to her mother's selfishness and her father's rashness. Both demigods simply wanted to get to Camp Half-Blood to have a safe haven against monsters. That, and maybe get to know other demigods. Misery loves company after all. But getting back on topic, the point was, Naruto and Zetsu were shady. Apparently, both were Japanese tourists on a vacation tour in the US. Which was surprising with how well they spoke English. No accent, no dragged sentences, nothing. It was like talking with any other American. Another surprising fact was how weird their dynamic was. Talia had no idea of how a functional family should act beyond what she'd seen on TV or in books. But their own family seemed like a stable one, and at the same time, not so much. Mr. Whiskers, for one, acted more like the actual son of the pair. He was childish, happy-go-lucky, and made it a habit to constantly annoy his son with awful dad jokes. At least Annie seemed to like them. Hell, she seemed to have grown attached to the man pretty fast, going as far as to act like an average little girl around him. Talia wasn't sure she liked that. Sure, children usually could be instinctually observant about a person's true character, but the way Annie just latched onto the man worried her. And no, she wasn't jealous. Anyone that says otherwise would meet the sharp end of her spear. Zetsu was weird in his own way. If his dad had whiskers, the teen definitely had a cat's grumpy attitude down to a pat. She could excuse part of it for being a teenager. She was one too and knew how volatile she could get about the silliest of things. But the boy's face seemed stuck into either a scowl or a condescending smirk. Well, that wasn't completely true. She sometimes caught a small smile from him, especially when his dad started either fussing over him or bragged about him. There was also the fact he was smart. Maybe that's why he wasn't in school. All Mr. Whiskers said that Zetsu didn't need school anymore. Early graduation, maybe? Or homeschooling? Whatever, she'd continue pondering on the many questions about the pair as she kept an eye on them. But she was sure of one thing: if the two turned out to be legit, then she'd stick around them. Maybe ask Mr. Whiskers for some pointers. Hey, having more power against monsters never hurt anybody. Luke was in a similar boat to Talia, although his thoughts were slightly darker. The teen did not trust the two strangers as far as he could throw them. Everything they did, from their meeting to their feats of strength, only seemed to validate his suspicions. Did his father send them? Or someone else? If so, then why? The Olympians already showed they couldn't give two shits about them. If they did, then his mother wouldn't be. Nope, not gonna venture down that road again, the boy thought, dismissing his dark thoughts before lightly glaring at the back of the blonde duo. He didn't care for the act the larger man was putting on, he wouldn't buy it. The eldest blonde just seemed too tough for a human, no matter what he said about training. He wasn't interested, he just wanted to get his two fellow demigods to safety for now. He'll think about his future then. Looking at the pair, he focused on the laughing Annie riding on Naruto's shoulder. He only agreed to let her do that because he wanted to keep things civil. He didn't know if the man was prone to anger if denied. He had plenty of experience with that type of people after all. He internally swore, regardless of his own weakness, Annie and Thals were practically family at this point, and if these two were to end up hurting them, he'll do his damn best to stop them. Annabeth liked Mr. Naruto. She knew she shouldn't, stranger danger and all. But he saved her and her friends, plus there was just an air about him. It reminded her slightly of her own father, if even better. Mr. Naruto was really kind too and made lots of good food for her, even giving her piggyback and shoulder rides when she got tired from walking. It was weird that the two didn't have a car, but maybe they just liked camping. It felt like months since she's met the bigger blonde, even though she knew it's barely been 1 week. That might be due to just how much fun she's been having. The entire trip started to feel less like an escape and more like a family trip. Luke and Talia have become the siblings she's always wished to have, and even Zetsu was getting there, even if he acted like a grumpy pants when Mr. Naruto told one of his funny jokes. He was smart though. Like crazy smart. Mr. Naruto said he was a prodigy or something, and Zetsu proved that by always answering the barrage of questions she's had to ask him. Even though he acted annoyed at first, he eventually answered her and sated her curiosity. She had told Mr. Naruto about how she wanted to grow up to be an architect, and the man laughed heartily. Architect, eh? Well, I hope you'll be ready for the challenges ahead. But you're a smart girl and I know you'll do it. Who knows? You might build the 8th wonder of the world one day. Yeah. Annabeth liked Mr. Naruto. He was a nice man. Even if he did react weirdly when she called him Mr. There wasn't much that Naruto had to complain about. Sure, this entire thing was risky, since avoiding the gods was the whole point in crafting their disguises. Zetsu had given him an earful some time ago about this. But come on! He couldn't leave these kids to their devices. If their parents were such asses that they couldn't be bothered with protecting their progeny, then that meant these kids probably wouldn't have lived long. He was the sole holder of the best father ever title, and he will die before he besmirches it by abandoning kids in need of help. Sure, the oldest blonde was a bit of an emo, and the older girl had a gleam in her eyes that reminded him uncomfortably of his old brother Sasuke whenever he saw a nice jutsu in the past. But you know what? These kids were alright. Especially little Annie. Why, if he had his way, the cutie would have become his official daughter from the day he met her. Too bad she insists on calling him Mr. Damn. Well, nothing he could do about it for now. Just gotta soldier on to that camp the kids kept whispering about. And maybe see if he could find some ramen around here, or maybe make it. He did spot a small field of wild foxtail millet a while back. Chapter 4: The Mysterious Tourists. Jiren no Hankyochi, or the home of the gallant, remains one of the greatest mysteries of history. One might call it the eastern version of Atlantis, a city lost to the sands of time. It was supposedly located in the middle of the East Sea, most probably back when the latter was still a landmass, thus placing it at an age older than the Ice Age. What made this city special were its inhabitants. As found in the Japanese Kojiki, it was said to be a place for everyone and anyone to live. It presented one of the earliest examples of coexistence between creatures of different origins, as it is written to not have only housed humans, but monsters, demons, and other such fantastical creatures. On the other hand, ancient Taoist texts related to the Tao Te Ching through similar narration chains paint a vastly different picture of the mystical city. What was seen as a symbol of peace and understanding for the Shinto was abhorred as a symbol of rebellion against the divine decree by the Taoists. Nevertheless, despite their differences, both stories share the same ending: the complete destruction of Jiren no Hankyochi. Because no ruins have ever been found, even at the bottom of the East Sea, most historians have considered this city as nothing more than a fairy tale. Excerpt from Legends and Wonders of the Far East by Professor Amanda Perkins. National Building Museum, Washington, D.C., 30th of June 2000. Zetsu had many siblings over the centuries. They weren't blood siblings, of course, he never had any of those. His father, weirdly enough, simply never had any children by traditional means. He instead either created them, as was his case, or simply took in children that caught his interest and raised them. They grew up, achieved their dreams and ambitions, and for some, were immortalized in legends. Amaterasu, the benevolent son. Maui, the brave adventurer. Quetzalcoatl, the radiant serpent. Anansi, the cunning spider. Miyamoto Musashi, the strongest samurai. These were but a few of his father's greatest children and students. Unfortunately, humans typically either exaggerated or twisted their feats and biography into something that was often unrecognizable from the original stories. But the point was, Naruto had a habit of taking in kids and having them join his family. So it came to no surprise to the green-haired Uzumaki that his father had taken an interest in yet another one. I just wish she was less talkative, Zetsu thought while glancing at Annabeth, the subject of his thoughts. The girl was holding on to Naruto's hand as she looked around in amazement at everything around her, and pointing at random structures and installations while firing off question after question. The tiny demigoddess had made a passing comment upon seeing an advertisement for this museum a few days ago when they came into Washington. Upon hearing her wish, his pops had proceeded to reserve an expensive suite at one of the best hotels in the city, much to the amazement of Talia and Luke. Where did he get the money for it? Well, you tend to gather a substantial amount of riches once immortality truly sets in. But in any case, it has been almost a full month since they've met, and while Zetsu could see that while Talia and Luke still had some lingering doubts, they were being chipped down daily. The younger Uzumaki wasn't surprised. His father had that effect on people. His kindness and gentle nature could reach just about anyone, most of the time. Bah, there was no need for these thoughts right now. This was still a family vacation, extra company notwithstanding, so Zetsu would do his best to at least enjoy himself. Looking back at the girl, he wasn't surprised to see she'd had his father lift her up so she could take a closer look at one of the exhibits. And then the questions came back in a vengeance. Zetsu could understand her curiosity. He had once been just like her too. It didn't mean her non-stop badgering and the never-ending wave of inquiries were any less aggravating. He wanted to tell her off, but every time he held himself back for two reasons. His dad would be unhappy, as he seemed content to humor the kid. His dad also gave him a look from the side every time the man felt a spike in his negative emotions. So Zetsu kept his mouth shut on the matter, and instead opted to entertain himself with the other two, who seemed to be uninterested in the exhibits around them, opting instead to bicker on their new favorite subject, Pokemon. Naruto had the bright idea to introduce the two teens to pop culture through a couple of Game Boys he had in his bag, some old games he carried for him and Zetsu to play, and a few older mangas that he had discreetly unsealed. As expected with many in their age group, Luke and Talia took to video games like fish to water. Since his father was usually finishing off most monsters they encountered, with the exception of the times Talia would ask to leave some for them, they had more time to indulge themselves in games and fiction. Which came down to their present hushed argument. I'm telling you, Thal's Squirtle is the best starter. Luke had his arms crossed and a steely glare directed at the demigoddess. And I'm telling you, Luke, that only an idiot would pick Squirtle over Charmander. Talia, ever the Spitfire, responded back with more heat. Squirtle breezes through the first two gyms, it gives you the best running start. Yeah, up until you get to mid-game and the fights start taking forever. Charmander might take a while to get used to, but that's only for bad players, Talia argued, her stormy eyes almost shining in frustration. Ha! Remind me again who has the most badges. Luke smugly replied. Ugh. You. Talia stammered, blushing in embarrassment before she crossed her arms, and turned her head away to pout. Charmander's a dragon. Dragons are cooler than turtles, enough said. She said. And how is this gonna help your gameplay? Squirtle at least gets the better evolution. Luke doubled down on her. Huh? Are you sure you've been playing the same game? The Ravenet snapped back. Bulbasaur, a voice interjected, making both teens whip their heads to its source. What? The answer came out of left field, so the two demigods were understandably aghast. I know what I said. Bulbasaur stomps all Zetsu crossed his arms, with a smirk so condescending it wouldn't have been out of place on an Uchiha. The hell it does. The two teens spoke in tandem before turning to each other with fire in their eyes. Stop copying me! They spoke again, this time grabbing each other threateningly, while Zetsu watched in amusement. Stop it! Damn it! The two butted heads, and it looked like it was rapidly escalating towards a brawl. Zetsu didn't seem to care though. Hell, he wanted to see some chaos. His lips twitched into a rare smile, a genuine one, at the almost sibling-like moment. Now to see if he could fan the flames more, they might get kicked out and finally do something fun. Zetsu froze at the word. He didn't dare turn, for he knew the beast was behind him. The two arguing teens had a similar reaction, with Luke having a tight grip on Talia's forearms, while she rammed the top of her head into his torso in an attempt to push him back. All three gulped and turned to the side of the elder Uzumaki, with an oblivious Annabeth standing next to him and still looking around. His voice wasn't loud, his eyes were closed, and a gentle smile was plastered on his face. Yet the sheer monstrous aura he exhibited showed the exact opposite of calmness. Luke and Talia had switched to holding onto each other for dear life, while Zetsu unashamedly ran back behind them and hid. He wasn't above throwing people under the bus. Or in this case, the 18-wheeler that was his father when annoyed. "Are you three trying to get us kicked out?" he asked, smile still in place, although his question drew shivers down the troublemaker's spine. But Talia tried to say, "Pap." The man shushed her. "Come on, guys. I believe we're still in a museum. Let's all have some common decency," he said with a straight face. Annabeth looked up at him confused. The other three looked at each other, with Talia and Luke gaining cherry-like complexions, and Zetsu peeking out, his face stony. "Really, Pops? Now?" The younger Uzumaki threw a disgusted look at his father, who flashed him a grin. Hey, don't pokey at my groove here." Ugh, Zetsu groaned, while the two teens snapped out of their embarrassment and snorted. Who even says groove anymore?" Talia asked with a smirk. "Old men," that's who Luke fired off with an equal amount of sass. While they didn't believe the man and his son were telling them everything, a month of traveling together had gone a long way in making them more comfortable around him. Naruto grabbed his chest, acting like he was shot. "Annie! Save me from the mean kids!" The grown man crouched down behind the girl and used her as a makeshift shield. The youngest demigoddess laughed in merriment at the group's antics. Olympus, Athena's temple. Athena narrowed her eyes. The twin pools of gray shined as millions of thoughts, ideas, and plans formed in her mind. Her hands blurred at superhuman speeds, taking down notes, and organizing the mountains of documents she was reading through. There wasn't anything special about that, it was simply standard behavior for her within the confines of her own temple. In an effort to cope with the insane speed her mind worked at, she had developed a peculiar habit over the last few thousands of years of her existence. If anything caught her interest, no matter how small, she would mobilize that same speed to craft an unearthly detailed analysis of her target. Her latest target, in particular, was something she rarely encountered, an unknown variable. She had sensed him through her own daughter, a stranger, and his son, who appeared out of thin air and saved Annabeth and her friends. While Athena was grateful for the heroic act and would have likely left it at that, if not even blessed them for making her little Annabeth smile and laugh so much, she had instead witnessed, from the time she kept an eye on her daughter, the man and his son display an abnormal amount of strength over the past month. How very curious. She had thought the two to be demigods, or a demigod and a legacy, based on battle prowess alone, but that theory had been dispelled the second she had gotten a feel of their energy. While she might not be as good of a sensor as her sister, she could still proudly say that distinguishing a demigod among mortals was an easy feat. That was not the case here, however. The energy felt more akin to that of a nature spirit, a little more potent than that of a nymph or a satyr's. But that wasn't enough to raise any alarms. It was instead the fact that both father and son were definitely male, and lacked a goat's distinct lower body, which in turn made them an outlier to both species she had initially thought of, and that detail made her so much more invested in their cases. After hearing their stories, a quick search on the Japanese census, surprisingly enough, showed information in line with what they revealed. Naruto N. Uzumaki and Zetsu N. Uzumaki, with no mention of a mother, curiously enough, were two Japanese citizens who came to the U.S. on a travel visa. While the father was an ex-member of the JGSDF, and now a humble ramen cook, a waste of talents if you were to ask her, it was the son's biography that made her raise an eyebrow. A high school graduate at the young age of 15. A prodigy in both sports and academics? How very odd. She was honestly intrigued. While there always was the occasional child genius, rare were those with an aptitude for both the mental and the physical work. But then again, if the Shinto were anything like them in that regard, then she could not dismiss the possibility of fraudulent information, missed manipulation and all. What was their purpose here? Are they related to the Shinto? Servants? Yokai? Scouts? The piling amount of questions and the uncertainty of it all bothered the goddess of wisdom. She especially was not proud of the lack of information she had about the more elusive gods of the Japanese peninsula. Bringing up the piles of books and papers she had on the subject, she was saddened to see the disparity between them and the little mountains of different literary works she possessed on Western civilization. The gods of the East were different from them. They never had to adapt like the Greeks, Norse, or Egyptians to the modern world, by spreading their influence through demigods and subtly directing the progress of humanity in a manner that benefited both their respective domains and the well-being of mortals. They never had to work to spread their stories and to prevent themselves from fading. The Shinto, Taoists, and Hindus have retained a large part of their influence over the millennia. The Hindus, especially, have become ridiculously powerful due to the number of followers they had, so much so that the very notion of a war with them was tantamount to suicide in Athena's opinion. It was almost laughable. The only way they would have a chance at survival if beings like the Trimurti decided to step up to them is in the unlikely case Zeus, Odin, and Ra managed to put their egos aside and form a temporary alliance between their respective pantheons. Something that won't happen anytime soon, mused the goddess, as her eyes roamed over the documents. As for the Taoists and Shinto, while their number of followers had noticeably decreased, many of their old shrines were still being used and many of their practices and traditions were maintained. Unfortunately, both of those parties had a rivalry going on that goes back thousands of years. This conflict had apparently started long before the Shinto chief goddess, Amaterasu Amikami, had earned her place at the top of her pantheon. The mysterious heavenly war was the trigger for it, and it was an event many scholars, god or mortal, wished to uncover more about. The two sides kept it under wraps, and all she had to go off of are apocryphal texts and unsettling rumors about it. The lack of valuable and concrete data only made ugly feelings of frustration bubble up in the goddess's being. She had many questions, many worries to be addressed, but could not do anything, both because of the ancient laws, and because she simply could not risk an interpantheonic war. Especially one with the Shinto. What they lacked in numbers to oppose the Greeks they more than made up in individual strength. Be it through their very own big three, Amaterasu, Tsukuyomi, and Susanoo, or through this cryptid that she keeps reading tidbits of. A man rumored to have stood toe-to-toe with the Jade Emperor, one of the strongest beings even amongst the gods. As ridiculous as the last notion sounded, she could not help the gnawing feeling that there was more to this story. If in any way it ended up being real, then that would mean the Olympians would have to face at least a pantheonic threat, and that wasn't a scenario she wanted to plan for. It all hinged on the question, just who was the gallant sage of the East? A question for another time, thought the goddess, hearing a chime from her office clock, and decided to move over to her other duties for now. She made a mental note to talk to her sister. Hopefully, Artemis can feel the two strangers out and give her a more accurate assessment of their threat level. She could not act rashly, nor illogically. After all, she is Pallas Athena, the goddess of wisdom, warfare, and battle strategy. She would not fail. Chapter 5, Brats of All Ages. Pops? What's that? Zetsu, now a few years old, tugged on his father's hair as he sat perched on his shoulders. That, my dear boy, is a baby, Naruto responded matter-of-factly. There was indeed a baby in the blonde's arms, and quite the odd one at that. Do all humans glow like that? The green-haired child asked. No, Zetsu-chan, they do not, the blonde nodded, very sure of himself. She's also very hot to the touch, he also noted, feeling a surprising amount of heat through his palms. The baby in question was quite the cute one, with a small pudgy face adorned with a small tuft of raven black hair. Her eyes were wide open and observing the sage curiously. Naruto himself was mesmerized by the beauty of her eyes, a pair of shining violets that could be compared to amethysts. Zetsu looked down at her with similar fascination, as this was the first human-like baby he'd ever seen. What is she then? He asked the obvious question, and Naruto, for one, was stumped. The sage had found the baby on the top of the Sunlight Mountain, one named by the locals for the fact it was perpetually bathed by sunlight throughout the year. The little one had been crying her lungs out for hours before Naruto happened upon her. The baby, as if sensing the man's warm aura, had immediately quieted down. Naruto knew what she was. He had met beings like her before, and her energy signature was quite similar to the people like Kagutsuchi or the Shinigami. This was a Shinto goddess. Well, that posed an issue. He still wanted some peace, for now, to see Zetsu grow up and explore more of Yamato and the surrounding regions with his little boy. He did not want to involve himself in some petty pullet. The baby whimpered as if sensing the man's hesitance. The decision was almost instinctive. Ah, screw it. He'd just have to adjust his plan to fit an extra passenger. As he looked once again at the little girl, he raised her up so she was at eye level with Zetsu. The babe reached out with her small arms curiously, making grabbing motions towards the short Immortal. Naruto gave his son his answer. She's your new sister, he said with a smile while Zetsu titled his head in confusion. Zetsu-chan. Meet Amaterasu-chan, the father said softly. Everything about her reminded him of his late best friend's technique. Flames as black as her hair, ones that could provide both warmth or burn anything to nothingness. This little one had a lot of potential. He could feel it. The baby, who had been silent up until that point, started babbling excitedly and reaching out for Naruto's face. Naruto smiled and let the girl pat his whiskered cheeks. His family was growing. When the sun met the sage. Tuckahoe State Park, Maryland, 23rd of July 2000. Artemis overlooked the diligent and coordinated work of her huntresses. The young ladies, clad in the hunt's signature silver parkas, were setting up camp for the night. They were divided into groups of 3 to hoist the tents, prepare the fire pit, and skin their bounty for the night. The goddess of the hunt smiled warmly at the sight of her girls. They'd been working hard lately, she thought, pondering on how to reward them for their perseverance. Maybe I could ask Aunt Hestia for a batch of her cookies. She almost salivated at the thought. Mine lady, a voice interrupted her musings, as she looked to the side, spotting a kneeling young woman. Her lieutenant, sister-in-arms, and best friend, Zoe Nightshade, had her head bowed. Her braided hair was adorned with a silver circlet that glowed in the moonlight. What is it, Zoe? Artemis asked. I never mean to question thy judgment, yet thou knowest this entire trip was behopeful? The dusky-skinned huntress did not rise from her bow. Artemis cocked an eyebrow but felt no offense at Zoe's question. Rather, she was more miffed with the fact the nymph still acted so professional with her even thousands of years into their friendship. And yes, the Shakespeare speech was not helping matters. Well, it's both a favor for my sister and an opportunity to test these mortals. They have 2 young maidens in their group, last I heard, the goddess answered. Zoe blinked up at her in surprise before her coal black eyes narrowed in anger. Are they hurting them? She hissed out. This time, Artemis narrowed her eyes and thought, from what I've seen from my chariot, it doesn't look like it. If anything, it's the very opposite. How so? Now it was the nymph's turn to be surprised. The goddess proceeded to explain to her how she had occasionally watched over the group at night as they journeyed through the East Coast. She'd seen how the only adult in the group guided them and helped them build a makeshift campsite for the nights they spent in the wilderness. She'd also gotten a faint feel of his and his son's energy. The blond man was indeed a strange one, as Athena had said. It's like looking at a satyr without goat legs, the goddess explained as best as she could. He just has that feel to him. And now art positive he's not dangerous? Asked Zoe skeptically. That's what I intend to find out tonight, the goddess answered simply. Making camp in this particular park tonight hadn't been a coincidence. From her vantage point on her chariot, Artemis had seen and heard many of the group's interactions, including their destination. While they obviously did not know where Camp Half-Blood was, they knew it was somewhere along the East Coast. Thus she had predicted their route and made sure to meet them at her leisure, both to see if she could get 2 huntresses out of it, and to scrutinize the males, and if necessary, either kill them or turn them into jackalopes. Decisions. Naruto led the group into the park. Over the last month, he had been able to sense more than one pair of eyes watching them, following their movements. However, the observers never made any aggressive moves, so he held his hand and silently accepted Zetsu's constant "I told you" SOS. Damn, why did his son have to be so petty? Yes, he took in a gaggle of demigods, and yes, he might have unwillingly attracted the attention of the Greek gods, thus making their mission many times more difficult, but you know what? Yeah, no, he had nothing. Zetsu was right to be mad, but that didn't mean he could hate on the kids for it, their victims here. His boy was not as empathetic as he was, and unfortunately, that seemed to be something innate to him. Zetsu just didn't care enough about a lot of things, living or not, that wasn't immediate family. Oh sure, he could warm up to people, but that usually took years. The 3 demigods trudged behind him, as he continued to lead them in the direction of whoever was observing them. It wasn't like he was changing the direction of his travels. Camping in that park had been within his plans since he entered the state and heard of it. On the contrary, going somewhere else would have alerted their spectators to his or Zetsu's sensing ability. He couldn't afford to screw this up more than he did. He was sure his son was at the tip of his rope with him. This is so troublesome, the man thought, unknowingly channeling his inner Shikamaru. Being the best father ever was hard work. He had to set an example, as well as make sure his kids were happy. Over the years he'd come to find that, more often than not, these 2 things tended to be mutually exclusive. Snap. Much like an alert deer, Naruto snapped out of his thoughts and perked up at the sound of rustling bushes around the group. Zetsu stopped next to him, while Talia and Luke had already taken defensive positions around Annabeth. The little blonde tried to make herself look bigger by puffing her chest up and holding up a bronze dagger given to her by Luke. Oh, that's adorable, the sage internally cooed at the little girl trying to look intimidating, and he fought the urge to take her picture. Before he could do that, however, about a dozen young girls wearing silver parkas and wielding hunting bows peeked out from the trees with the weapons trained on the group. A cloaked girl with chestnut-color hair and hypnotizing silver eyes was at the head of the group. To anyone else, it would look like a group of young adolescents being led by a girl their own age, if not younger. Halt, mortals! The girl's voice was cold and commanding. Naruto was about to greet them, but before he could get a word in edgewise, someone beat him to the punch. Huh! Who are you? Talia quickly trained her spear on the brunette. Her action was apparently a faux pas, as every other archer adopted a fierce expression and trained their bows on her. The one to voice their thoughts, however, was a young lady wearing a silver circlet. How dare thou point thy weapon at Lady Artemis? The girl barked at them before the apparent leader held their hand up. Zoe, calm down, it's a common mistake, the goddess in question interjected, making the girls reluctantly lower their weapons. Luke, seemingly understanding the situation first, elbowed Talia and hissed at her to drop her weapon. Naruto was confused a little about the situation. While he had felt the leader's power and quickly singled her out as a goddess, her willingness to cause misunderstandings by turning into a young girl baffled him. And that other girl, is she talking like she's in medieval England? The sage thought while scratching his head. All in all, the entire group's mannerisms were pretty quirky. But then again, quirky was far from bad, and it made things more fun. Naruto smiled and raised his hands in a gesture of nonviolence as he attempted to pacify the situation. Ah, hello there, young ladies, he tried but was rudely interrupted. Silence, boy, do not think you can address me so casually, the goddess rebuked him. Naruto blinked at her behavior, especially at the way she talked to him. Huh! What's with these trashy manners? He narrowed his eyes briefly. For a second there, he considered responding with something witty, maybe something like, "What's with this sassy lost child?" Naruto would then point at her while looking at everyone else. She'd get angry, maybe shoot him with her arrows or a curse, and he'd respond as civilly as possible by punting her across the country. Yeah, no, doing that will be opening a can of whoop-ass. The sage nodded to himself at his wisdom. He would not kick the child. Unless he wanted to burn down the entire state in the ensuing fight with her family, he had to accept her attitude, for now. So, reluctantly, he swallowed his pride and smiled pleasantly at the huntresses. Even though he wished to grab the goddess by the ear, and teach her some common courtesy. Later, Artemis sat in her tent in her adult form whilst deep in thought. The travelers had been separated, with the girls being taken by her huntresses, despite their protests, to be checked for injuries, and the males being isolated to a clearing outside the camp, with clear instructions not to approach the tents, or else. The girls would be brought before her in a few minutes, to both ask them questions and make her offer of joining the hunt for them. While Artemis wouldn't say it, she secretly wished the man would have taken offense or even tried something. It would have given her a quick excuse to turn him into a jackalope. But no, as if he knew what was at stake, the man and his son, surprisingly enough, did not so much as throw a glare in her direction. Yes, she taunted them, and yes, she might have also acted in a way that would have earned her a lecture by her aunt, but she also had ample justification for it. The oldest male was too odd, too strange for her tastes. While he did look surprised at their arrival, he also did not look intimidated in the least. She had felt his level of power, and needless to say, it was far from impressive. A little more power than the average nature spirit maybe, but nothing to ring alarm bells about. Could he somehow be suppressing his aura? The goddess thought, before hurriedly scratching out that option. No, nothing could hide from her senses. While she did not possess her brother's foresight, her other senses were the finest among the Olympians. So much so that she often, as her brother put it, nerfed herself so she can enjoy life with a bit more challenges. Something these same senses allowed her to do was to assess the threat level of pretty much any creature. And yet, these same senses indicated nothing threatening about the blonde, even though Athena's warning said the opposite. She wouldn't admit it, but she felt quite miffed at how unaffected he and his son were by her aura. He was polite but not out of fear, civil but not cowed, despite the large gap in power. That contradictory behavior confused her all the more, and she could only arrive at two possible conclusions. Either the man was an unpredictable wild card, or he was an idiot. She concentrated a little on the part of her driving her chariot. It was the same ability her brother used to pretty much see any and everything under the light of his own chariot. A scene formed in her mind's eye, one where the three males sat around a small campfire of their own and had a conversation of their own. She did, surprisingly enough, notice a brief tenseness in the father and son's posture before both relaxed and continued their discussion. Can they sense me too? The goddess asked herself. She saw the man start making funny faces, excitable movements, and steer the conversation in a direction which visibly relaxed the blonde demigod. So not an idiot, but still, as harmless as he was, he's definitely hiding something. Artemis nodded to herself. Just as she finished her thoughts, her tense flaps were pried open as Zoe entered, followed by the two demigoddesses. She scrutinized the two girls. While one was obviously upset, at her huntresses maybe, the other, younger one, was looking around in childish awe. Artemis smiled warmly at the sight. While it was true that the hunt and the moon were her primary domains, one must not forget that she was also the patron goddess of children and maidens. So occupied with the girls was she, that she never noticed a small black worm-like creature slithering from under the bottom of Talia's shoe and seemingly camouflaging itself with the carpet. The two demigoddesses had spent the night with the hunt, while the males camped outside. The two girls returned in the morning, with Talia somehow having a more pronounced resting bitch face than Zetsu himself had, and Annabeth running excitedly to Naruto's figure to tell him all the details of her night. The younger Uzumaki was honestly reaching his patience's limit with all the bullshit that recently happened. He knew taking in the three brats was a bad idea and he should have protested more to the idea. Then again, his pops was even more stubborn than a mule, so that would be a worthless endeavor. So, unbeknownst to his father, Zetsu had let go of a small part of himself and let it attach itself to Talia so it can sneakily infiltrate the tent. Much like his own father, Zetsu could clone himself. Unlike the sage, however, he could also asexually reproduce, or at least, make more bodies whose mind could be both independent or linked to his. They also had his ability of complete suppression, something that not even his own father could replicate. They were the perfect spies, unseen, unheard, and very much loyal to him. Ugh! He knew he was taking a risk with this, but after all the idiocy his father pulled? Yeah, he was entitled to some safeguards. If the Olympians wanted to play, then Zetsu was about to pull out an Uno reverse card on them. When Uzumaki's played, they played to win. Chapter 6: The Not-So-Crazy Snake Lady. Author's note: a lot of you might not like this chapter, since it does put the focus on a part of Naruto's personality that a lot of the fandom doesn't like. Naruto looked at the old man seated in front of him with a glare. The geezer was grinning at him, not at all affected by his stare. Naruto scowled and looked at the objects in front of him. How many can I choose? For who you're fightin'? As much as ye can handle, brat. The old man grinned at him. You realize I'm older than you, Kagutsuchi? Naruto huffed at the Shinto god of smithing, who just grinned in response before he reluctantly started putting the different accessories on. Mara, the evil one, sat upon his throne of skulls as he smirked to himself. Truly, his plan had worked out without a hitch. While the Trimurti and other gods were busy with the monstrosities and curses he unleashed, he would move his other troops forward towards the eastern coast. He did, however, have to deal with one last annoyance before he could declare his victory. Just as he finished that thought, the giant iron doors to his throne room were blasted open by a powerful kick. Mara rolled his shoulders and prepared himself for one of the best fights of his life. His esteemed guest had arrived. He smirked to himself. So you've finally arrived. The being paused in surprise. What the hell are you wearing? An embarrassed Naruto speed-walked into the room, somehow dressed less fashionably than a circus clown, with an assortment of divine artifacts and cloths to boost his power. It's my ass-kicking outfit. Bitch! Hollered the sage. A younger Immortal's silly memory. Leeds Point, Southern New Jersey, 2nd of September, 2000. Luke was honestly having a great time. Something that would have surprised anyone that knew him, seeing as according to Talia, he was edgier than her spear. Well, okay, then, Ms. Tsundere. He only knew what that word meant because of the two tourists. So he was happy. And how could he not? After that fateful night in the woods almost a month ago, pretty much all of his doubts about his new family had disappeared. When he had been told to stand aside while a goddess spoke to, and possibly took away his companions, he had honestly felt an immeasurable amount of despair. He hadn't had a nice childhood, not with his mother's fits and deteriorating mental health. That's not to mention his deadbeat of a father who, even as a so-called omnipotent god, could not seem to make time for his kid or the woman he loved. Or that's what his mother claimed whenever the subject was brought up. Point was, he had honestly been at his lowest during that night, but something that Mr. Naruto, or Mr. Whiskers as he and Talia had taken to calling him, had said had given him a small inkling of hope. Hey, what's that frown for, buddy? You don't seriously think that low of our friends, do ya? The man had continued to say how he was sure the girls would return, that the battles and good times they had spent together had forged an unbreakable bond between all 5 of them. Yes, 5. Maybe it was during these couple of days they had spent on the beach before taking a boat to come to New Jersey, but at some point during the trip, the blonde demigod had felt his worries slowly ebb away and had truly started to enjoy his time in the group. Mr. Whisker's bad jokes, Zetsu's over-the-top reactions to them, Talia's snark and attitude, and Annabeth's childish cheer. And yeah, maybe his edgy self too. Everyone had their quirks, but everyone also had the other's back. Mr. Whiskers had become the fun uncle, he'd go so far as to call him the group's dad, Zetsu was the stick-in-the-mud older brother, Annabeth was their adorable little sister, and Talia. Yeah, he had some conflicting feelings there. Oh, don't get him wrong, he certainly loved her, but he wasn't so sure this love was platonic anymore. Maybe it was just puberty jumbling up his feelings, or maybe he really did find a girl with freckles to be cute. He'll ponder on these feelings later on. Growl. After they had dinner, that is. Damn, how long until they reach Aristao? Luke yelped as he bumped into something. Naruto was in a good mood too. Things have been looking up ever since that bratty goddess had tried, and failed, to separate them. Ha! As if Lil Annie and Talia would just jump ship like that. He was still irritated at the way she treated him, so much so that he had half a mind to march up to her parents, Zeus and some lady called Leto, go figure, and give them a stern talking to. Because the girl's attitude screamed spoiled, and while part of it might be the goddess's own fault for refusing to grow up over her time among mortals, most of the blame usually falls on the parents' shoulders for failing to rear their child properly. If anything, with what he read about the girl's story, maybe it wasn't surprising she grew up like that. Being the product of an extramarital affair, having the stepmother out to get her and her mother, and apparently, and that last fact genuinely shocked Naruto to the core, having her own dad tell her about her own conception in detail. Zeus boy, if I ever see you, you're getting an ass beating out of principle, the sage internally swore. Then again, that might not be an option, seeing as it would contradict his entire objective for being here, and there was no guarantee the story was real. But if it turned out to be real? And he and Zeus coincidentally found themselves in a remote enough place? Oh ha ha ha. He'll be throwing out so many hands he might as well call himself Hashirama. Growl. Ah, hungry again. Damn it, he knew he should have eaten that extra bowl. Ah. Naruto was startled when he heard Luke yelp in surprise and the sound of something breaking on impact with the ground. Turning around, he saw Luke on his behind while a statue lay on the ground in pieces. Luke, are you alright, my boy? The elder Uzumaki strode towards him and helped him up. What's wrong, Makedge? Got your head in the clouds? Talia was clearly not one to miss an opportunity for teasing. Oh, you'd know all about that, wouldn't you? Luke snapped back before he looked at whatever he hit. Naruto did the same. Fuck, the man thought. The statue was ridiculously detailed, to the point it almost looked real. This is gonna be so expensive, he inwardly cried looking at the statue. The work put into it was so detailed that the father could only assume it'd be worth tens of thousands of dollars, if not more. Yes, he had tons of money, but that didn't mean he liked to throw it haphazardly. Naruto ignored the two demigods bickering, while Annabeth stood by Zetsu looking at the scene worriedly. He knelt down to inspect the destroyed stone to see if he could patch it up with some basic earth release and leave without being seen. He'll bullshit an excuse to the kids later. That plan was thrown to the grinder, however, the moment his fingers made contact with the stone. Naruto almost recoiled in surprise. This isn't a statue. The man's eyes had unknowingly shifted to a golden color as he detected the trace amount of natural energy emanating from the stone. This was a corpse, a petrified human corpse. Someone that was exposed to a raw amount of natural energy and turned to stone as a result. He wouldn't call it senjutsu, but something close. A sudden spike of negative emotions alerted him to someone's presence. Oh my, hello there! A feminine voice called out, making the group turn towards her. The woman before them looked Middle Eastern and was clad in a dark robe, a headscarf, and a pair of sunglasses. There wasn't much else to describe her. Even with the shades on, Naruto could tell the woman was observing them. The sage noticed her emotions darkened considerably when her gaze swept over Annabeth. That's a lot of anger. A quick scan of her energy confirmed the man's suspicions. A monster. More specifically, the one likely responsible for the poor sod's unfortunate end. When I heard the sound of one of my pieces breaking, I thought for sure another bear had gotten on the property. But thank goodness it wasn't the case, the woman said, ignorant of Naruto's thoughts and the kids' apprehensive stares. They evidently had a hard time trusting strangers for obvious reasons. Just as Talia and Luke opened their mouths to speak, Zetsu interjected with his hands raised. We're sorry for the trouble, ma'am. We'll pay you back for the statue. The younger Uzumaki started with a placating tone while he looked at his father from the side. Good, Naruto thought. Zetsu had caught on to the woman's nature. Oh, that old thing? There's no need for that. The woman waved her arm dismissively, something that made Naruto's anger rise. Although he refused to show any outward reaction and opted to keep a blank look. I'd much rather you join me for some supper. I rarely get visitors around these parts, the lady said, before gesturing to her home, a large building built like a cabin. The sign on the front read Auntie M's Garden No Emporium. Luke and Talia's stomachs instinctively growled, making the two blush in embarrassment. Annabeth walked up to Naruto with a worried expression and tugged on his shirt. Huh! "Oh, Annie," he patted the girl's head, "you guys go on ahead, I'm going after you in a bit," he called out to the rest before looking at Zetsu. The boy met his eye and nodded, understanding the wordless message. "Engage if you must, but try to wait for me." The group filtered into the house, with the demigods thanking the woman for her generosity and Zetsu standing between them and the monster. The sage waited a few moments until he was sure no eyes were on him, before he slapped the ground next to him. The stone piece shifted and sank into the ground, which had suddenly gained a muddy texture. They soon disappeared and a small stone rose from the edge. It was a grave. The man knelt before it, clasped his hands, and muttered a quick prayer. "It's not much, but it's the least I could do," he thought melancholically. Due to his proficiency in the sage arts and his previous connection to his sworn siblings, Naruto had become as close to an empath as anyone could get. That ability alone had largely shifted his perspective on the world around him. He had over the years become someone who cherished life and did not tolerate any disrespect towards it. He rarely killed for anything other than nourishment, and if he did, he made sure his enemies received a proper burial. No sane person wanted or deserved their remains to be paraded around like a trophy or left at the mercy of the elements. Despite his power, he believed every sentient creature had the right to live its life as it wished and die as it wished. It was an overly idealistic belief. He knew that much since the world was never that kind. But if he could preserve someone's dignity when it was tarnished, he would do so without a second thought. There was simply no reason not to. The blonde got up from his position and looked around at the rest of the statues. "Don't worry, guys, I'll be back for you. Just gotta scold somebody first." He walked towards the building with a determined expression. The man entered the emporium and saw the rest of his companions seated on a table in a corner of the main room. Looking around at the various pieces being displayed, he couldn't help but be impressed. Monster or not, that lady had some good taste in art. Now if only she had the decency to refrain from callous murder and not desecrate the dead, that'd be great. "Mr. Naruto, the lady is really great. She's making us burgers." Annabeth, ever the excitable child, was bouncing in her seat. He wouldn't fault her. Hamburgers were apparently a meal that kids just universally liked. Even Talia, who was normally all about being cool, couldn't help the slight bounce of anticipation. Burgers being her favorite and all. Luke and Zetsu for their part were deep in a conversation of their own, with the blonde demigod seemingly arguing a point that Zetsu took great satisfaction in rebuking. The father smiled at the kids. "Well then, I'll just have to go and thank her, won't I?" He waved at them and continued towards a side room, probably the kitchen, where sounds of utensils being moved resonated. The woman had been in the middle of preparing a burger patty when she heard the door of the kitchen open, then close behind her. She turned around in surprise and saw the blonde man enter the room, a bright smile on his face. She put up a fake smile and looked at the man. "Oh, sir! How may I help you?" "Ah, no need for the sir. Just call me Naruto. I just came here to thank you for your generosity and offer my help." The blonde rubbed his hands together and approached her. "Oh, there's no need for that, Mr. Naruto. You are guests here." The woman's smile strained a bit as she waved her hand at the man, shooing him off. "Oh, but I mustard insist. Can't let a lady cook all by her lonesome. My mind simply wouldn't be at cheese." A small snort escaped the woman before she daintily covered her mouth with a hand. "Oh, you got jokes, do you?" Despite her hand, Naruto could tell the woman was smiling genuinely. "You better believe it," the man winked with a grin. This time, a giggle escaped the robed woman before she scooted over and gestured for Naruto to come to help her. A few minutes passed in silence between them, with Naruto chopping up vegetables while his host continued preparing the patties. Deciding he's had enough fun, the sage finally decided to end the pleasantries. "So you make kids' meals often?" The sage once again kidded, although the woman did not seem to catch it. "Oh no, people rarely come in these parts, let alone children." She spoke, seemingly sad. "Really? With all those statues outside, you must truly be making a killing." This time the woman looked at him sharply, her brows visibly narrowing. Medusa was suddenly very alert. The emphasis on the last word did not escape her. She backed up a short distance and looked at the man, only to feel a chill crawl up her spine at the absolutely bone-chilling smile he was giving her. Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to return outside," she cursed herself for stuttering in front of Immortal. She was Medusa, damn it! She steeled herself and raised her hand to her sunglasses. The man didn't flinch. His face, which was stretched in a mirthful grin moments earlier, had been replaced by a grim visage that spelled something foreboding for her. He knew. He saw right through her act, her fake smile, her trap. But it wouldn't matter, he wasn't the first to do so, and he certainly wouldn't be the last. All she had to do was petrify him, and do the same for the others. Especially the little one. She could smell Athena's stench wafting off her. "You know, I can forgive a lot of things in life," the man asked her, as he washed his hands. "But targeting kids is a big no-no, you know?" His frigid smile stayed on his face, his tone remained cheerful despite the serious nature of his words. Medusa shook off her shock and raised a hand to her sunglasses. What was she afraid of after all? One look and the problem would be solved. She slowly sashayed towards him, like a predator approaching prey. "Oh? And whatever do you mean?" While her tone was innocent, her smile was anything but. "I'm just a simple," she continued, only to be interrupted. "Cut the bullshit, will ya?" The blonde father's voice froze her in her tracks. He approached her as well, until he stood face to face with her, while still looking into her lenses. She wouldn't falter, not now. "Oh? And who might you be?" The woman choked as a powerful hand lifted her off the ground by the throat. "I'm just the guy looking after these kids," he replied, looking up at her struggling form. She ripped her glasses and scarf off of her head in response, exposing her face and hair to the world. "Die," she croaked and looked into the man's eyes. Her own pair glowed as her curse activated itself. And nothing happened. "What?" she internally screeched, narrowed her eyes, and opened them wide, gazing once again into her aggressor's own. And once more, nothing happened. Impossible, her slit eyes flashed many times. Is he really mortal? The snakes making up her hair struck the man's arm and injected as much venom as they could into his veins. The man raised an eyebrow and his lips slowly formed a smirk. "That's a nifty trick you got there. Were you going to use it on the kids?" he asked, but received no answer, as the woman's face started to turn blue. Seeing this, he blinked owlishly, then abruptly dropped her, and she collapsed to her knees to take in some much-needed air. The man rubbed the back of his neck and looked at her sheepishly. "Sorry about that." "Why you? Who are you? What are you?" She panicked and crawled back until she hit one of the closets. The man, who up until now had looked like he would end her, suddenly did a 180 and grinned at her. "I already told ya, didn't I? I'm looking after these kids." He thumped his chest with his knuckles. "Can't let you turn them into an art exhibit, you know. That's just not cool." She glared at him with as much hate as she could muster. "He's toying with me, bastard." She was fuming. Call her pretentious, but she was used to her opponents seeing her as a threat. Even the more powerful demigods she'd slain had the decency to look alarmed when she pulled out her claws. Then again, with how he resisted her curse and venom, he might be someone with a god in his corner. Naruto looked down at her and pouted. "Bah, he'll indulge her a bit." Fine, call me Naruto Uzumaki." He paused and looked at her for her turn. When she kept giving him a nasty look, he extended a hand towards her. "And? What's your name, lady?" he said with the same expectant tone. She kept glaring at him. "Stop screwing with me," she finally said. He tilted his head to the side. Her negative emotions, which had already been practically pouring off of her, exploded like a geyser. Rage and malice were on the forefront, but behind all that, the tiniest traces of sadness, grief, and guilt? Why would Naruto wanted to slap himself for missing the obvious clues? Snake hair, stone statues, glowing eyes. Damn, Zetsu was gonna scold him for being such an idiot. "Stop fucking with me," said snake-haired monster screamed, snapping the man out of his thoughts. Right, air mimosa or something, he thought, quite sure of himself. "Are you a god? A monster? What are you?" She screamed at him with her eyes glowing a sulfuric yellow. She got screwed over, didn't she? Or at least that's what the book Zetsu gave me said. Naruto ignored the monster's incessant screaming in favor of his own thoughts. If you want to kill me, just do it. Don't play with me like a toy. Her face was flushed with anger as she flashed her claws at him, and got into a crouching position. He finally brought his attention back to the situation and chose the most appropriate response he could think of. I'm sorry, did you say something? He said with the most aloof tone he could muster. He couldn't help being a troll even in these situations. Kakashi-sensei would have been proud. Rahhh, the woman roared, and much like an animal, she reared back her claws and pounced on him. He raised an eyebrow at her action, and just as she reached him, he raised a hand in front of her face and flicked her. Crack! The sound of bone being crunched echoed out as her momentum was all but reversed. She flew back to the opposing wall, knocking over shelves and kitchen utensils and causing a cacophony of noise. The monster remained on the ground, surrounded by broken plates, cups, and other objects, with her nose almost torn off from the force of his attack. Medusa had almost blacked out. The blow, as insignificant as it looked, held a Herculean amount of strength. Naruto approached her with a steady gait, and then crouched in front of her quivering form. Sit up for a bit, he said, and she obeyed, albeit trembling. If one were to look at her now, they'd be surprised to see the monster acting like a scared puppy, for she was now aware of the sheer difference in power between her and that thing. He's not human! He can't be! She shook in fright. The man, against all odds, sat down on the dirty ground in front of her and looked into her eyes. He smiled at her, this time with a gentle look in his eyes before he raised a hand to her cheek. She froze at the contact before a wave of warmth filled her, and she felt her nose shift painlessly, readjusting, rest-stitching, and healing itself. What's your story? The father asked her softly. She gazed at him with eyes half-lidded from the relaxing feeling. You mean you don't know about me? Medusa? She asked hesitantly, as all the fight had left her. Oh, I do. I read about you before. He paused and winked at her. But see, I'd like to hear it from the source. The snake-haired woman was silent for a while, contemplating his words, before she shook her head and looked at him resolutely. Could you just kill me, please? Whatever game you're playing, I want no part of it. She hated being treated like a doll. It's all she ever was before. Her dark musings were interrupted by the man's hum. Then how about a trade? He grinned toothily and held up his fist towards her. I'll tell you about me if you do the same. Sound good? He elaborated and nudged his hand towards her. Here. Boop it, he said, and she raised an eyebrow at the confusing gesture. What? The monster blinked, utterly lost. Boop it, he repeated, grinning like a loon. She tentatively raised her fist and approached his own. They bumped. And suddenly, she understood. She understood everything about him. His past, his motivations, his actions, his feelings. Everything was unveiled for her, and she felt breathless. She almost gasped as several memories played in her mind, both happy and sad ones. How could someone like that exist? If she were to compare it, she'd say it was like being bathed in a ray of sunshine, warm and comforting. How was his soul so pure? She looked up at him and was flabbergasted at the sight before her. He's crying. Naruto's lips were fixed in a tight smile, while tears wetted his whiskered cheeks. He finally looked at her, and she received the shock of her life when she felt him envelop her in an embrace. You really went through a lot, huh? You poor thing. His words struck a chord within her. She stood there, frozen, unable to react as a normal person would to the gesture. How long had it been? How long had it been since she'd received such a gentle touch from anyone? Since she'd received any form of comfort? She'd been betrayed by the love of her life, then by her own patron, then by the entirety of humanity, as she became something to hunt down and exterminate. A monster to be hated and abhorred. She had long since snapped and abandoned her humanity, done unspeakable things over the years, both in the name of survival and vindictive pleasure. She did not deserve this. None of this. They sat together in silence, the man holding her while she stared blankly in front of her. Why are you doing this? She whispered as the man held her tightly. The remainder of what she saw when she bumped her fist to his nod at her. She caught a glimpse of his true identity, of his power. There was nothing for him to gain from this charade. He could have erased her very existence and sent her to oblivion 1,000 times over. But she'd also caught glimpses of his true self. A warrior, a philosopher, a jokester, a ramen addict, but especially a father, a man filled with love and kindness. Naruto and Uzumaki never gave up on people, no matter who or what they were. I'm a monster, I killed countless people, she protested weakly, even as she internally knew what his answer would be. But she still needed to hear it. Her worries won't rest until she hears him speak. Naruto let go of the embrace and held her by the shoulders, looking directly into her slit eyes. His eyes, it's like gazing into the sun. You've gazed into my soul and I've done the same. Medusa, your humanity is still there. If it wasn't, then your heart wouldn't carry all these deaths like a burden. She raised her hands to her mouth to hide her choked gasp. Her eyes were closed and yet tears flooded out of them. Lives that have been lost can never be recovered, but if you're willing to change, I will stand by your side and help you. Help you start over, he said and squeezed her shoulders firmly. This time, as Naruto hugged her again, she tentatively raised her arms to his back and squeezed. Medusa wept in the arms of a stranger, as all the guilt, the frustration, and the emotions she had bottled for her entire existence as a monster burst forth. For the first time in eons, someone had finally seen her as something other than a despicable monster. Someone had seen a woman who lost her way. That's it for part 1. Thank you for watching and see you in the next video.